Welcome back, my favorite Tzaddik and Chassidim. I hope you're doing well. Today's episode, we are going back to the circus that is One for Israel. And we'll be reviewing a number of clips today from various interviews, actually about a half a dozen interviews. And we will be looking into a common theme that we find in a lot of these interviews. And that is how a lot of people come to, it's not even Messianic Judaism, it's just simply Protestant evangelical Christianity. During great times of psychological distress, emotional distress, very challenging emotional times in their lives, during times of their life where they are hallucinating, where they are being hospitalized in psychiatric wards or being forced to see psychologists. And so, while I do want to point these things out, I also do not want to make light of their suffering, because suffering is a very deeply personal and serious matter that I don't want to make light of for any of these people. I really feel kind of terrible for the suffering that all these people say that they went through. And these are only a little smattering of all the interviews that contain material like this. But I tried to pick some of the best ones that were most demonstrative of this common theme of I was suffering, I was under a lot of psychological duress, and then came to Jesus. So, respectfully, without further ado, let's get into some of this material.
My son, at the age of 5, was diagnosed with Asperger's. He was not verbal. He was very distant. He was the cause of me going back to school and becoming a special education teacher. I knew a lot about science. I studied a lot about everything, but I really never even opened the Bible. Ironically, I was teaching Hebrew school as a side job, teaching the prayers, teaching the liturgy. I mean, I knew everything. I had seen my father pray the prayers and put on the talid, and I know all of the rhetoric and everything that, goes along with being Jewish, but I didn't feel any connection to God. I would sit at synagogue, and I tried to feel something. I tried to feel God. And it was like the Chagall stained glass windows and everybody around me and the bima and the ark and the Torah being taken out. And I remember feeling nothing.
Now, notice what this woman says. It was her son's autism diagnosis that sparked her interest in going back to school and bettering herself, and we're all for that here. Go become the smartest, most capable people that you can be. But this led to her realizing that and I mean this with some respect, but that she was basically an ignoramus. In Hebrew, we would say an am haaretz, right? Just a common person who doesn't know very much, right? And she's saying that in the synagogue life and in her prayer life, that all of these things were meaningless to her and that they had no depth. And people will look at that and say, oh yeah, old Judaism versus new and living Christianity. But then what's funny is that even on the same channel, even on One for Israel's channel, they have another young lady who, she looks young anyway, and who says that she loved the synagogue life and she loved davening in the Siddur, the prayer book, and that she loved going to the synagogue and that she found it very meaningful. So let's take a look at that. And we'll see that this actually has nothing to do with Judaism itself, but has everything to do with a person's own faith and potentially also just with the movement to Judaism that they're in. The First Lady seems like she went to a Reform or conservative congregation, which tend to be pretty liberal. They're the people who have lesbian rabbis, quote unquote. And this younger lady, she grew up closer to Orthodox, as she says that she grew up conservadox, and she was much more familiar with just traditional Jewish life, which is more authentically Jewish life. So let's take a look at that.
I grew up in a family that was, I would say, like conservadox. My mom grew up Orthodox, my dad grew up Reform, and they kind of switched places. My dad became more Orthodox, and my mom became less. We kept kosher. We did, place for milk, place for meat. It was always there, always present. We're Jewish. And I was very happy to be Jewish, and I never wanted to be anything else. I used to go to shul, and we'd sit there and we would pray along with everybody. And I'd keep up with the English because I didn't always understand the Hebrew. And a lot of the time I could feel God's presence there. I just felt like God is here. But then I would go and I would pray and I wouldn't hear back. You know, I liked synagogue. I loved the liturgy. I loved the tradition. I liked even keeping Shabbat, which, you know, isn't always popular, but I liked it.
So even from the internal evidence, meaning even from content from One for Israel's or One Against Israel's website, we can find that there's nothing wrong with the shul. There's nothing wrong with the synagogue, right? There's nothing wrong with the siddur, the prayer book. There's nothing wrong with the ritual. Many people find this very enlivening and very rich and very meaningful and very fulfilling in their lives, as do I. The first lady did not, the second lady did. Right? So what this is telling us is that it really depends on the person. And so no matter the type of emotional distress a person is going through, how they handle that in part depends on how they were raised, what kind of Judaism they grew up with. Was it I apologize, but the fake Judaism, the imposter Judaism of the Reform movement, and even of the conservative movement, I'm sad to say. There are more traditional sides of that movement, but a lot of them are pretty liberal as well. Did somebody grow up in an uber liberal movement and then found no spirituality in it? It's like, well, duh. All of the liberal religious, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, they're completely devoid of spirituality. They're devoid of deep history. There's no connection to the past. There's no connection to your neighbors or your family. There's nothing. It's been completely declawed and defanged, and like its eyes have been poked out. Like it's completely impotent. So no wonder you weren't finding very much meaning in it, because you never knew it to begin with. And this isn't to be mimicking the Christian argument of, oh, if you were a Christian and then you leave, then you were never a true Christian to begin with. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Because once you're Jewish, you're always Jewish for the rest of your life, no matter what you do. Even if you become a Christian like these people. But the thing is that if you never get to experience like historical Judaism as it's been practiced for, depending on what part of the faith we're talking about, between 1,000 to 3,000 years, if you never get to experience that, you're not actually getting to experience Judaism. Right? Imagine if somebody went to a Unitarian Universalist church and they're like, oh, I don't like Christianity. It's like, well, that's not actually historical, traditional Christianity, right? It's not getting a fair shot. So going forward, we're going to be looking at a number of interviews where most of these people say, I had no Jewish background, I had no interest in God, and then I had psychological breakdowns, I had emotional problems, I was suicidal, I was put in the psych ward, and then, praise Jesus, I got religion.
I'm Andrew Klavan. I got the worst possible mark in every class in Hebrew school. And my father used to say they can't flunk you out of being Jewish, but I came very close. By the time I was bar mitzvahed, I was so completely estranged from this entire tradition, I didn't want to do it at all. It meant nothing to me. I gave in, I had to. I was forced to be bar mitzvahed and say these things that I didn't believe. So I ad-libbed the Hebrew in my bar mitzvah because I really barely learned the portion of the Torah I was supposed to read. I was making up Hebrew words to get through it. I was just anything I could to get through. That was what I wanted. I applied to the University of California at Berkeley because it was so far away from my New York home. And I went in to the first of my terrible, terrible depressions. I called them the bola because they were like that throwing thing. It would just kind of appear out of nowhere and wrap itself around my throat and choke me with this sorrow. And I was torn up. I was so broken and crazy inside that I didn't understand, how to communicate with other people, how to write stories. I knew I had a talent for writing stories, but I couldn't write stories that people liked because my mind was so messed up and I was so full of rage and twistedness it didn't appear. I wasn't like a crazy person. You looked at me and you would have thought, well, he seems like a really, all put together guy, but I was not. I was really broken inside. And I didn't know I was going insane. I didn't realize I was going mad because I had that romance of the intellectual. An intellectual is miserable. An intellectual faces things. He tells the truth. He looks life in the eye, and life is meaningless, and life is death. And because he sees these things, he's a man of sorrow. And so I just thought I was a typical intellectual. It's like that song. It's hip to be miserable when you're young and intellectual. That's what I thought I was. But I was in so much pain. I did begin crying out to God in this kind of sick, superstitious way. I mean, I remember, trying all these kind of spiritual experiments to try and get clear. I was in my bedroom and my wife was outside. Sometimes she would sleep on the couch so I could work in the bedroom because that's where my desk was. My little baby daughter was in her nursery. I was drinking, not heavily, but I was drinking a scotch and I was smoking cigarettes and I was thinking about killing myself. I had had suicidal thoughts before, but this was different. This was the real deal. I was sitting there thinking, I don't know how to live. I do not know how to live. And there was a radio playing a baseball game, the Mets game. And it was just playing in the background. I wasn't listening to it. I was just sitting. I was thinking about throwing myself off the roof because we lived in an 8-10-story building. And I was just thinking I could just walk up there and everybody would be happier. My wife would be better off. My daughter would be better off. I don't know how to live. Anyway, that was the last time I ever thought of suicide. I was reading a book, a sea adventure story, great book. I love Patrick O'Brian, great author. At the end of this chapter, it said, his name was Matron. It said, Matron said a quick prayer and fell asleep. And I thought, well, if he can say a prayer, because he was a very intellectual character, I really loved him. It was a series of books, and I just really identified with this character. I thought, if he can say a prayer, I can say a prayer. My father was afraid that by embracing Christ, I would be leaving Judaism behind. But weirdly, I never really felt connected to my Judaism until I found Jesus. When I found Jesus, that was the first time I started to think, oh, that's what all that stuff in the Bible meant. That's why, there were those traditions. That's why there were those passages that never meant anything to me before. I always had a connection with my cultural Judaism. I always knew I was a Jew, was happy and at peace with that. But I never understood the religious aspects of it until Jesus came into my life. It's absolutely true. Until I was baptized, I don't think I was a Jew.
It turned out that I had a very rare susceptibility to hypnosis that I didn't know about. I felt something change in me. I felt something controlling me. I remember seeing this dark cloaked image with a bony finger, and he had my parents in a dome, and he said, "You'll never see your parents again." And I remember at one point waking up and noticing that the streetlights were his eyes. And I felt that presence of that force once again. And it was as if I could hear him speaking. And he said, "Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?" And I said, "No, I don't want you here." And it was as if a veil pulled back and that fiery face that tormented me when I was a child, that I saw and haunted me in my dreams and all of those things, was there. It was coming back again from when I was 3.5 years old or 4 years old. And I said, "I'll kill you." In the meantime, my mom had called the police. They came in. They heard me say, "I'll kill you." When the first one came, I threw him 10 feet across the room, a little 16-year-old skinny kid throwing a big cop. So they knew something was up. I didn't know where the power came from, but it was something that definitely got their attention. And they took me to the hospital, and they were trying to figure out what it was. It was so unusual and so different. They had never seen anything like that. In my freshman year of college, I was living off campus. I was keeping kosher, I wore my yarmulke, I was doing all these things. I was with my roommate. We had some things that happened that were very unusual and made me feel very under pressure. I felt the presence of that force again that I hadn't experienced since high school. And I thought that was all done, and I got really nervous. And in that moment, I found myself quietly asking God, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? And then it came up in that process, the issue with my roommate about Jesus. And I thought, oh, gosh, it's a setup. This is crazy. I said, God, if Jesus is real, I couldn't even say the name. It was so anathema to me. And as I said it, I felt something stirring up and rising up in my stomach. And I thought, whoa, what is this? And I tried it one more time and it happened. I said, you know what? I don't know what this is, but I'm going to sleep. So the next day, my friends asked me, and my roommate and his friends asked if I wanted to go to church with them. And I said, what do I want to go there for? And inside something said, you need to go there. There's something I need to see. I just knew I had to be there, but I had never been in a church, and it was the last place I would have thought to go. Kind of thought they believed in three gods, spoke Latin in church, and hated Jews. And so I assumed Jesus was the biggest anti-Semite of them all, because that's the one they claimed we killed, and that was the one that they claimed was at the forefront of everything they believed. But at the end, they did an altar call, and 2,000 people, about 100 people went forward. And then he said, there's one more person that wants to come forward. And this went back and forth for a while, and nobody went up. And then finally said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not doing this. And I felt that force again. I said, oh, I want to do this. Well, by the time I wrestled to do it, I stood as he said, everybody be seated. And I'm the only one standing. And I could just feel everybody looking at the one guy standing. And then he said something. He said, bring him down. Bring him down here. It took 6 people to get me to the front. All of a sudden, I was praying with him in a chair, and I felt again this rush and this flush of electricity. So I knew it wasn't a man. I knew there was something there. There were no wires. There was nothing. I knew something supernatural had happened. A couple of days later, I was on the phone with my mom. And in the conversation, she said, Jan, you sound so happy. You sound so at peace. What is different? She said, well, what is it? Maybe I can do it. I said, well, I wish you would, but I don't think you want to know this. She had scheduled for me to see rabbis. She had scheduled for me, I'd say 5 different rabbis, a psychiatrist, a psychologist. She had the whole thing set up for me.
Growing up in a very Jewish cultural environment, it never really felt to me that God was a big part of anything. It was much more social. It was that you go to synagogue because you're Jewish, but I don't ever remember God being at the forefront of anything, other than simply going through the liturgy, the memorized portion of the prayers, that was just, once again, part of having a Jewish identity. I was a very committed athlete. I started wrestling in 7th grade, and every year I got more and more focused on this sport. I would go to sleep at night, and I'd envision myself with my hand raised being the state champ, and I got to the place where I felt there was nobody that I could not beat. I felt like I was in control. It was a great time in life, but things changed just like that. When I looked into the future as a senior in high school, now that wrestling was over, I realized that the world was so much bigger than I was, certainly so much bigger than the people that competed in my weight class in wrestling. I felt afraid. I lost my identity. I lost my purpose. I just got more and more lost and more confused. I spent as much time as possible just sleeping to escape the emotional turmoil that I was in. I asked myself, what can I do to give myself that feeling back that I had when I was wrestling? It was such a dark time for me that I had a difficult time remembering any of the good things that had happened to me in life. And I go to a sales manager's meeting one night. There was about 6 of us, but myself and the another sales manager there, we were the first ones to arrive. We were alone before the others showed up. So this other sales manager starts telling me about a book he had been reading called Autobiography of a Yogi by a guru from India named Paramahansa Yogananda, who actually introduced yoga to the Western world. And I was really fascinated by what the sales manager was telling me that he had discovered in the book. He said this guru can beat up tigers with his bare hands and they levitate off the ground. And I always had kind of a mystical mindset. I think Jewish people are attracted to the supernatural, and I always believed in God. And so I went out and bought the book. It was the first book I ever bought with my own money. So I'm reading this book, I'm looking at the pictures in this book of this guru supposedly levitating off the ground, and I'm thinking, God, if this is real, if this guy can really levitate off the ground, I said, I found my new wrestling. I found it. This is my new goal. Whatever I need to do, I want to do what I need to do to be able to levitate off the ground, because I imagined in my mind's eye, I thought how great I would feel levitating off the ground. And I thought, this is a way higher reality than making money. So I'm devouring the book. It was a big, thick book. I set up a little New Age temple in my bedroom because he was talking about meditating and looking for your third eye. So I'm sitting in my little New Age temple in my bedroom, trying to concentrate on my third eye. In the meantime, I'm becoming more and more fearful for some reason. One night, I go to sleep in my bedroom. I'm living still in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm living with my parents. And it was a hot August night. It was 1978. And I remember going to bed this night, the incredible headache that I had before getting into bed. I go to sleep. Now I want you to know I've never done LSD in my life. No one had ever witnessed to me. I had never read the New Testament. All that's happening in my life is I'm lost, I'm struggling, I'm looking for answers, and I'm thinking somehow maybe if I can levitate off the ground like these Eastern gurus, I'll have maybe found the answer that I'm looking for. So I go to sleep this night, hot August night, once again, 1978. Then in the middle of the night, beloved, I'm woken from my sleep into what I would describe as a state of supernatural awareness. Suddenly I go from being unconscious in my sleep to now realizing I'm not sleeping anymore. My eyes are closed, but I have like a heightened state of consciousness. I'm supernaturally aware that something's going on, a really high state of awareness. Then instantly in this state, in color, in a vision of the night, Jesus appears on the cross. And I go to sleep one night. It was 1978. In the middle of the night, I was awoken from my sleep. Suddenly, in color, Jesus appeared on the cross. A ray of red light from straight through the sky beamed down on his head. God had just showed me that Jesus was the way Tim. The vision lasted no more than 2 seconds, but I was aware what had happened. And I was so excited because somehow I knew that something supernatural had just happened to me. I got up the next morning. I started talking about it, telling everybody about it.
So I'm 3 years into this now. I've been following him for 3 years. And I decide one day that I'm going to spend all day seeking God. I'm sitting in this chair, and suddenly the Spirit of God literally appeared above my head, just like in the book of Acts chapter 2. I saw him with my own eyes, but it wasn't with my natural eyes. It was somehow with my spiritual eyes, but I saw as clearly as I could see with my natural eyes. And the way the Spirit of the Lord appeared above my head was it was a spirit of life. It was spirit of life. It was in motion. I could not have helped the experience along. Neither could I have stopped it from happening. It was just suddenly, bam, God was there, twirling above my head in all the colors of a rainbow, just spiritual life, all the colors of the rainbow in this spiritual life. Then he came through my head. And again, I want to stress, I couldn't have helped the experience along. I couldn't have stopped it from happening. It was just that sovereign, bam. He came through my head, then he came into my soul, my inner man. Somehow I just knew that there's something inside me that's different from my head because I felt him come through my head and fill and take possession of my inner man. And then I audibly heard his voice.
We went back to my home, but one of the bodyguards was with me. He slept in my bedroom that night so that I couldn't escape. And then the next morning, he and I drove to one of their rehabilitation houses in California. It wasn't too long after that. I walk in the home, I see that there's some suitcases standing right at the door. And my dad points out the window to the street, to the parking lot area. He says, "You see that police car out there? We've probated you to the psychiatric ward of Mount Sinai Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio." Was locked up in the psychiatric ward for 2 months. It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life. Every day I would wake up and there was no place to go. You couldn't get out. You were locked in this ward. It was a terrible, terrible experience. After 2 months, I was released. So as a Jewish person, I have been through a lot because of my faith in Jesus. But for me, when I saw the ray of red light in that vision come down on Jesus' head, I knew it was coming from God. I'm so solid in my faith in Jesus. Number one, because of the supernatural experiences I've had. Secondly, because I see how the whole Bible is a unified whole and how it all fits together, that going through experiences like the ones that I just described, it never shook my faith. I know that I know. Sure, there's been times that it's like I feel, well, God, where are you? I don't feel you. There's been times that I've got discouraged, but I've never wavered in my faith. See, when I built my life on wrestling, my life was built from the outside in. My life was dependent on something disconnected from myself. But when wrestling ended, I fell apart. Now I'm building my life on something that's from the inside out.
I ended up in Amsterdam, Holland. And I came there with merchandise to sell because I ran out of money. It was there that I've met a group of very enthusiastic young believers in Jesus. And I said, well, I'm Jewish and we don't believe in Jesus. And they said, why? Jesus is Jewish. And I said, I'm not sure why, but I'm sure we don't believe in Jesus. And I felt very strongly that I need to go and tell my people. I decided to surprise my family. My dad was there and I told them that I believe in Yeshua, the Messiah. The consensus was that in some way or fashion I've lost my mind. My dad's family, they have arranged for me a meeting with a chief psychiatrist in our city. Is there any Bible school or Bible college or something like that I can go and invest some time and just study the Bible? And they said, well, no, there's nothing. And I completed my doctoral studies in the United States.
Now notice what he does. He says, I was passionate about the Bible. I really loved Scripture. I wanted to get closer to God, so I moved to America and got my PhD. What does that imply? It implies that he got his doctorate in some kind of biblical studies and pastoral work and theological studies and New Testament, something like this, right? Maybe he went and got his doctors of divinity, right? Or doctorate in divinity. And so I think this is the logical implication, right? But that is simply not so. The truth of the matter is, and this is still a very impressive feat, by the way, I don't mean to marginalize or take away from his accomplishment, but he went and got a doctorate in psychology, right? Which again, super hard to do. I'm not trying to marginalize that at all. I love psychology. Actually, that was my original major in college. I love psychology. He did an amazing, difficult thing in getting his doctorate. But you can know a lot about psychology and know nothing about the Bible. And yet he's saying that he wants to start this Bible college and he wants to, do this and do that and do missionary work and try to get the word out. But what does he actually know about the Bible? Who taught him? He says that he grew up without any knowledge of the Bible. He says he learned a little bit in his public school education, but that it had no personal connection to him, and that it was just a subject in school, right? So, I mean, he was familiar with some of the characters probably, he knew some of the stories, but if it wasn't part of his faith, then what is it? You might as well be an atheist at that point, right? And maybe he was, I don't know, but I get the feeling that he probably was not, so I don't want to slander him in that way. But hypothetically, you can be a very intelligent atheist, and if your faith has nothing to do with the Bible, then, what's the point, right? It doesn't mean that atheists are wrong in what they claim about the Bible, but it does mean that they're limited. Because this guy has a very strong faith in Christianity, which ultimately does have some kind of connection to the Bible. He's trying to say that because he's so passionate about God and he's so passionate about Christianity and he just is craving to get into the Word, that this qualifies him to be a teacher. And it's like, sorry, look, passion does not make for good teachers. Knowledge and passion make for incredible teachers. Knowledge alone, it makes for okay teachers, right? If somebody's incredibly boring or they're not a good communicator, then they're not going to be conveying that knowledge in the way that it needs to be conveyed. But if somebody has a passion, they have the knowledge, and they're a good communicator, then they're going to make any subject that they're talking about interesting. And so, look, this guy clearly has the passion. You can tell that he's sincere, but the knowledge is severely lacking to the point where what he knows is almost useless. And what he's lacking in knowledge, look, we're all lacking in knowledge, but you want to be a teacher, you have to at least know the subject. And unfortunately, he doesn't know the subject.
After that, with my wife and young children, we came back to Israel. I knew that God has called me to serve Him, but I didn't know exactly where. I remember very vividly how it felt coming to know Yeshua and having a deep desire to study the scriptures and not knowing how to do it. And I felt very strongly that I need to go and provide this opportunity.
Again, take note of what he's saying. He's saying he had no biblical knowledge, but he was really passionate and really sincere, and he wanted to help other people learn the Bible. It's like, shouldn't you be teaching yourself before you start trying to teach other people? Like, what information are you going to tell them? You're just going to hire a bunch of people so that they do the work for you? Which, look, there's nothing wrong with that per se if you want to run a business. Which, look, I mean, that's the way that he got started, isn't it? Is that he went to Europe, he went to Amsterdam, got involved with Christians there on a business trip. Again, nothing wrong with finding God on a business trip. But his whole testimony is around business, right? Trying to make money here, trying to make money there. And look, I hate it when people are like, oh, you only do, X, Y, and Z to make money. But look, the truth is sometimes people do that. And I don't know if he, in particular, is doing it for this reason, right? In fact, I'm more inclined to believe that he's just a sincere guy who is trying to get the word out about his beliefs. I think that that's the case. However, when money does get involved, you kind of have to start asking, it's like, you're doing this for the money? You're doing this because you are genuinely passionate about your faith. I think that he is passionate. But, again, when money's involved, you just have to look at it a little bit skeptically. Not baselessly skeptically, but with some reasonable suspicion. Not doubting it, not believing it. Just be cautious. Be a little suspicious.
For Israeli believers, both Jewish and Arab, to study the Word of God in Hebrew right where it happened. And to that, I dedicate my life.
Alright, so now to wrap up today's video, the First Lady, she seems to have had some kind of midlife crisis because of her son's autistic diagnosis, or Asperger's diagnosis, and through this she eventually comes to faith in Jesus. And Andrew Klavan, again, I have respect for him and the work that he does at the Daily Wire, because he works with Ben Shapiro and a lot of other decent people, and he seems like a decent guy himself. But he said that he was undergoing serious depressions and anxiety and suicidal ideation, which, look, I've been there myself, and it's a very difficult thing to be in. And I don't judge him at all for anything that he went through, right? I'm not saying that he's a bad guy. I'm not saying anything like this. But when a lot of these emotional disturbances are leading to these big life changes, you do have to kind of wonder, are you having spiritual experiences? Or are you having psycho-emotional disturbances? And unfortunately, for a lot of these people, I think it's the latter. And then you had Kurt Snyder, who said that he was having visions and imagining things and hearing voices. And, feeling electricity. Actually, I think that was the guy before him, but that he was seeing demons, that he was possessed, and feeling electricity all over his body. Like, these people are having severe psychological issues, and they need help. They don't deserve judgment. They don't deserve mocking. They don't deserve trolling, as fun as it might be to do that sometimes. They need help. They need compassion, right? They don't deserve any kind of negativity coming our way. But again, just because we need to be treating them well does not justify their theological beliefs or their religious decisions. Just because somebody has a mental breakdown or a midlife crisis or is intensely psychologically disturbed and is interred in the psych ward, whether they are brought to psychologists, counselors, whatever the case is, just because you're undergoing these emotional and psychological disturbances does not mean that whatever resulted from these is correct. There are people that undergo the exact same things. They turn to Judaism. They turn to Islam. They become atheists and they reject God altogether. So what are we to make of these other people? They claim to have received visions. They claim to have had spiritual experiences. So what, we just take the Christian ones? Right? That's the logical fallacy of special pleading. We can't do that. Right? We have to treat people equally. We can't just play favorites and say, oh, the rules apply for thee, but not for me, or vice versa. So, anyways, this was just to give us a survey of some of the backgrounds of some of the people that are drawn to One for Israel. That One for Israel, or One Against Israel, as I like to call it, because that it really is what it is. One Against Israel is very appealing, as is Christianity in general, to people with severe psychological and emotional disturbances. And unfortunately, this has influenced their religious path and many of the very significant choices in their life. Again, without judgment, without any negativity, I wish these people the best. I wish that they draw closer and closer to God constantly, as I wish for all of us. And let's leave it at that. I hope you all do well, and thanks for watching.
Tzaddik, like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the ride. We're living.